Hello, in this video I'll show you how to make meatballs. These go perfect on top of spaghetti or as a meatball sandwich. I start by making the panade, which is going to form the base of the meatballs. A panade is a combination of liquid and starch. In this case, I'm using 1 cup of gluten-free breadcrumbs and 1 cup of whole milk. I let the milk soak into the breadcrumbs for at least 10 minutes before I add any meat. The benefit of using a panade is that this is going to form a gel that will actually coat the individual proteins in the meat and prevent it from getting too tough or drying out. It's also going to hold the meatball together. Next, I add a teaspoon each of salt, onion powder, and garlic powder. Then I add 3/4 teaspoon each of basil and oregano. Now I stir everything together and let it sit for at least 10 minutes for the milk to fully absorb into the breadcrumbs. I'm using homemade breadcrumbs, and I have found that depending on the type of bread I use to make the breadcrumbs, it absorbs different amounts of liquid. In this case, the panade was a little bit too runny, so I added another ½ cup of pre-made breadcrumbs. I let this sit for an additional 10 minutes after stirring in the breadcrumbs. The texture that you're looking for is a little bit gooey, and you don't want a lot of loose liquid in the bowl. While the breadcrumbs are soaking, I prepare the baking sheet. I line the baking sheet with foil to make for easier cleanup. Then I place a wire rack on top of the baking sheet. This will allow for better airflow as the meatballs are cooking. Now that the panade is done soaking, I add in the meat. I use 1 pound of ground pork sausage and 2 pounds of beef. In this case, the pork sausage is 20% fat and the ground beef is 15% fat. You want both meats to have at least 15% fat in order to have a moist meatball. I try to work quickly to mix the meat by hand and avoid overmixing the meat. It's important to mix the meat quickly because our hands are going to warm up the fat in the meat, which will just make it cook out of the meatballs faster. We want the fat to stay in the meat as long as possible so that the meatballs won't dry out. We also want to avoid overmixing the meat because this grinding action will release sticky soluble proteins that can make the meat too tough. Next, I use a 2 tablespoon scoop to scoop the meat out and form it into the meatball. Then I place it on the prepared baking sheet. This recipe makes about 35 meatballs, which will not all fit onto one baking sheet. If you don't want to make as many meatballs, you can definitely half the recipe. I like to make a large batch, cook some for dinner that night, and put the rest in the freezer to warm up later. These warm up really great in sauce. I'm filling my scoop with the meatball and then dropping it into my hand. Then I roll the ball in between my hands just to compress all the meat together and make sure that they're a uniform shape. I'm trying not to leave the meatballs in my hands for too long so that the meat doesn't heat up. Once the first baking sheet is full, I start preparing a second baking sheet. I'm just placing the meatballs on this second baking sheet. I'm not actually going to cook them on this sheet or at the same time as the first pan. There's 2 reasons that I'm going to cook the batches individually. The first reason is because I prefer cooking the meatballs on the wire rack. This allows for better airflow around and between the meatballs for more even cooking. It also allows the excess fat to drip off so the meatballs aren't just sitting in fat the whole time they're in the oven. The second reason I'm not cooking both batches at the same time is because having 2 baking sheets in the oven is going to block airflow and block the direct heat from the bottom of the pan. I cook the meatballs in 2 stages. First, I preheat the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, but right before I put the meatballs in the oven, I turn it off and turn on the broiler. I broil the meatballs on high for 12 minutes. Then I turn off the broiler and turn the oven back to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I bake these for an additional 8 minutes at 350 degrees. The meatballs are fully cooked when the internal temperature reads between 180 and 190 degrees Fahrenheit. I put the first batch of meatballs onto a plate and then put the second batch of meatballs onto the wire rack to cook the same way. Now that the meatballs are fully cooked, serve them over spaghetti or as a meatball sandwich. Thanks for watching this video on how to make meatballs. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.